Hi, I'm Mr. Muso. Today we want to talk about European history. We want to talk about Napoleon I. There's an interesting question that we want to discuss here about Napoleon I. Here is the question. A citizen devoted to the well-being of his nation. A citizen devoted to the well-being of his nation. How far is this how far is this reflected in Napoleon's I's domestic policy? How far is this reflected in Napoleon I's domestic policy? So was he a citizen devoted to the well-being of the nation? We want to look on this. Was Napoleon interested in fulfilling the ideals of the French people? Was he interested in fulfilling the desires of the people when he came to power from 1799 to 1815? Then after that, now we talk about the other side of the question. Let's start with the first side. He was a devoted citizen to the well-being of the nation. That is true. Why do we say so? Let's start with the economy. He introduced the Bank of France, which people borrowed loans. They started to do self-reliant projects, and that on its own led France to become self-sufficient. Food was now in abundance. Food was now adequate for so many people, and that clearly showed that Napoleon, he was a devoted citizen to the well-being of the nations through establishing the Bank of France. You talk about the issue of industrialization. So many industries were started, people were absorbed in these industries. The problem of unemployment, it was done away with. Industries started to manufacture, and when the manufactured goods were sold to other countries, trade was revamped, trade was improved. So that clearly shows us that Napoleon, he was a citizen devoted to the well-being of the nation. Why? It is because the livelihoods of people, they were changed because of industrialization and trade, which was now carried out with other neighboring countries. Again, the French money gained value. The goods were now affordable to the people. That led people to benefit from these domestic policies that Napoleon I introduced. You move on, you also talk about another domestic policy that Napoleon introduced economically. Farmers in the rural areas, they were given inputs. Farmers in the rural areas, they were given implements to use. By giving implements, giving them implements, it led food again to be produced in large quantities. So the problems of food shortages, they became a thing of the past because of this. So he was a citizen devoted to the well-being of the nation. Then you move on, you also talk about what Napoleon did. We see that our public works were started economically, the issue of employment, construction of schools, bridges, roads, they were constructed. That's on its own improved the livelihoods of people. People were absorbed in these public works that were started, and Napoleon clearly showed that he was a citizen devoted to the well-being of the nation. We talk about the social reforms. What did Napoleon do? Socially, he established the Code Napoleon. Laws were now codified, laws were now meaningful, and when they were codified and they were now meaningful, people benefited in the sense that these laws were no longer haphazard, but they were now meaningful. We now had the Civil Code, which dealt with the family. We now had Commercial Code, which dealt with the buying and selling of goods, importation, exportation of goods. We now had also the Criminal Code, which dealt with criminality. So these laws were now more meaningful. That clearly showed that Napoleon, he was a well-being interested in the livelihoods of what? Of the people. He was interested, devoted citizen in the well-being of the nation. You talk about the career open to talent. People were encouraged to pursue areas of their talents. That was good, and clearly showing us that he was a devoted a citizen interested in the well-being of the nation. You also talk about career, a legion of honor, honoring people who did well. If you are doing well, you're supposed to be honored. Those who did well, they were honored. That is what the people wanted. He was a citizen, again, devoted citizen, interested in the well-being of the nation. You move on, you also talk about the church. He established good relations with the church, 1801. That is what the people wanted. So he was a devoted citizen, I wanted to say Christian, a devoted citizen who was interested in the well-being of what? Of the people. Then we move on, we also talk about what he did. Also, socially, land remained in the hands of the people. People were still in a position of using land that they had acquired during the course of the people. That is what the people wanted. So he was a citizen interested in the well-being of the people. But we see that on the other side of the question, he was a despot, he was a dictator. For example, the consulate that he established, he had too much authority, he had too much power in the consulate. He dominated the consulate. The people who were in the consulate, they were directly appointed by him. So that clearly showed that this statement is true to a lesser extent. You move on, you also talk about in 1804, he went on to be coronated. He went on to re-establish the sacrilege laws, clearly showing us that this statement is true to a lesser extent. He was a dictator or he was a despot. You move on, you also talk about the arrest of the Pope in 1809, 1810. That clearly showed that Napoleon, he was a dictator. You move on, you also talk about what Napoleon did in education. Education, we see that there was indoctrination. So children were indoctrinated to think that Napoleon, he was the only person who was capable of ruling the country. That is an element of indoctrination. So this statement is true to a lesser what extent. You talk about also the issue of the Code Napoleon. On the Code Napoleon, men were given too much power, men were given too much authority over their women. That clearly shows us that Napoleon was a despot or a dictator. So this statement is true to a lesser what extent. Then the issue of the Bank of France, it benefited the Bonapartists at the expense of the other classes, other people in the society in France. So that on its own clearly shows that he was a despot, he was a dictator. That clearly shows us that this statement that says that Napoleon was a citizen devoted to the well-being of the nation is true to a lesser what extent. Then you move on, you also talk about what Napoleon did socially. The issue of Legion of Honor, it is said that it was meant to honor the soldiers and the police only at the expense of the other people. He wanted commitment from the police. He wanted the army so that he could conquer neighboring tribes. So we see that this statement is true to a lesser what extent. So that is what we talk about on the other side of the question. On the other side of the question, you talk about Napoleon what? Despotism. So that is how we answer this question. Let's go back to our question again. A citizen devoted to the well-being of the nation. How far is this reflected in Napoleon I's domestic what policies? The question is clear now. So I gave you the first side, then I gave you Napoleon's despotism on the other side. Thank you so much. I am Mr. Muso.